Good afternoon. A warm welcome to our presenters, to our guests. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Roxana Marcoci, the David Dechman Senior Curator of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art, and it is my pleasure to introduce this forum on contemporary photography, together with my colleague and co-organizer, Caitlin Ryan. This convening brings together a formidable group of artists and writers who will share with us their views on how pictures might estrange conventions of entrenched forms of representation, offering alternate propositions about the experience and observation of the world. Organized on the occasion of the survey exhibition, Wolfgang Tillmans, To Look Without Fear, this forum reckons with a question posed by the artist: are new pictures possible? Changing technologies, formats, and platform of civic engagement have extended the parameters of vision, expanded the social sphere of photography, and transformed the way images are shared and understood. The question then is an acknowledgement of the possibility that pictures can create a poetics of relation, both aesthetic and political, by sharing a consciousness of self and cosmic surroundings, by shaping a transformative community beyond colonial structures of knowledge, and undisputedly by keeping true to the critical power of vision. With that, I would like to invite Wolfgang to say hello and perhaps a few opening words. Wolfgang?
Thank you, Roxana, for the invitation to this really exciting forum, and thanks for this fantastic group of diverse people sharing their perspectives on this subject. I am in London and I can stay the first full hour, but then have a freeze event that I have to attend, unfortunately. But I've recorded my contribution beforehand.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Very grateful for you making also time between other events in London. And this is the situation probably with also Sonia, who is our first speaker, the artist Sonia Boyce, whose deep exploration of the exploration between sound, language, and image, and also her participatory approach made her a key figure in the burgeoning Black art movement of the 1980s and continues very much today. Incorporating film, photography, and sound in multimedia installation, Sonia's caring and inclusive practice has fostered a sensibility that questions cultural hierarchies and authorial authorship. Most recently, Sonia received the Golden Lion for Feeling Her Way, the best national participation at the Venice Biennale, an unforgettable tribute to forgotten British female singers of African, Caribbean, and Asian heritage. Sonia, thank you so much for joining us. It is an honor to have you present.
Oh, thank you so much. So I want to speak, if I could have the first slide, please. I want to speak very briefly about the relationship between performance, documentation, and the possibilities of these photographic images. In the early 2000s, I was trying to get to grips with my art practice, which had changed significantly, in fact, beyond all recognition, even to myself. I had, in the 1990s, begun to shift my art making away from myself as the central protagonist and rather shyly asked other people if they would let me photograph them doing a simple task. Exquisite Tension came out of a performance residency that took place in Mexico in 2004 that was led by performance collective La Poca Nostra, founded by artist Guillermo Gomez Piena. I had applied to the residency to get a better understanding of performance art. This was my first journey from a maker's perspective, and the program comprised of workshop exercises that focused on crossing and extending borders. One of the exercises paired participants and challenged us to consider what made the other person different and what made them similar. I'd been partnered with Richard Hancock, who's quite tall, and I'm short. He is white and I am black. We both had long hair. I decided to try and plait our hair together, and we then agreed to try and walk around together by our conjoined hair. The exercise was so intriguing to me that when I returned to the UK, I wanted to restage what this might have looked like and invited Adelaide Bannerman, a curator of performance art, to step into what had been my place. Richard and Adelaide had never met before this encounter. I later asked both to reflect on their understanding of the work, but for some reason I've lost Adelaide's response. I do, however, have the response of Richard. Next slide, please. As a starting point, I was considering what I said about the work feeling very comfortable, despite the obvious points of physical tension. I didn't feel any sense of unease or discomfort in being bound in a very physical way to someone who I'd never met. I think that this is interesting in itself, as there are very few conditions under which we would normally find ourselves in such a situation. These are mainly sexual, medical, or cosmetic, and all carry their own kinds of tension and or unease. Next slide, please. There's something about the image when I think about it that doesn't fit easily with the experience. The experience was a physically very calming one, yet intellectually I'm frustrated by something which has the potential to be a very corporeal and physically charged image, but it is always robbed of its energy by an overdetermination of codes of race and gender. The physical construction of the image is so overt that I think it could be read as hyper-race and hyper-gendered, and continuing on this path, hyper-heterosexual. Any embodied experience of actually performing the work is already overwhelmed by the potential of the codes available to the spectator. These are importantly codes which are less available to the performers. During the filming, the person I had least visual access to is Adelaide. In this sense, the calmness of the activity perhaps already preempts this failure. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. There are a couple of things I've been, sorry, if you could go back. There are a couple of things I've been grappling with regarding Richard's response. It does seem strange to me that as a performance artist who uses his body as the basis for his practice, that Richard felt uncomfortable that his gender and race might be a defining factor or even noticeable. My summation is that he becomes more visibly white and male through his relation to Adelaide. This begs the question, is whiteness and maleness meant to be hidden in plain sight? Or to put it another way, is Adelaide's race and gender always apparent, always to be announced, always politicized? Part of my rationale for conjoining them was also to highlight the relationship between curator Adelaide and artist Richard, although that connection seems to dissipate as a framing for the artwork. Next slide, please. The second issue that arises is the question of the gap between the performative action and its record or document or image. Here, Richard seems to suggest that the code of the image takes precedence over the action, that a break has occurred between the atmosphere of a performance and the contingency of the photographic record, that the image is no longer expected to be a full representation of what it depicts, that the image can have the upper hand as the remaining legacy of an action. I was only fully able to engage with this question in recent works, and I don't know what took me so long to realize that the production stills from performances could have a life of their own. This is an image of an improvised and unscripted performance that took place at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in London, and is titled We Move in Her Way, with performers, sculptures, and an invited audience who were encouraged to get involved. Next slide, please. That I could turn these stills into their very own otherworldly present no longer needed to be faithful to its referent. Next slide, please. And in fact, I've been using these stills as the basis for a series of repeat pattern designs, wallpaper, taking a leaf out of Paul Clay's pedagogical sketchbook, published in 1925, where he talks about drawing as taking a line for a walk, but in this instance, taking a photograph on a journey. Next slide, please. It's probably important to say that during these improvised performances, I don't direct what will take place and I don't look through the camera. I work with a crew and see the footage only after the event. I like to see through their eyes and then my own editorial process begins. Next slide, please. To make something else of the imagery. Next slide, please. This last image from my current exhibition, Feeling Her Way, in the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, is of singer Tanita Tikaram. Next slide, please. Just one of the transformed images from that set of performances. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. And it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Sarah Swinar, whose photographs, films, and videos, and assemblage installations combine and layer materials from a multitude of sources, from eBay to discarded photo albums to art history textbooks, to meditate on the complex ways visual culture accumulates and disperses, permeating our collective consciousness. And with that, I will welcome you, Sarah.
Thank you. Can I have the first slide, please? Okay. So in my films and photographs, I often ask a series of questions about novelty. Why would we make anything new when there is so much already? Is the new even possible, or is it an old idea used to reinforce the status quo? What forces keep us attached to the idea of the new, and how does the constant presence of novelty in our everyday lives make us feel as both a source of anxiety and promise? Thinking about the question, are new pictures possible? I'm also thinking about the way that pictures contribute to the idea of the new with all its possibilities and emotional force. In my film, Rose Gold, shown here, I use the pink Apple iPhone and connect this object to other objects and images in which color was used to make something old seem like it was new again. Here's a brief excerpt from the video. Next slide.
They invented this color, rose gold, and I'm mesmerized. A new object of desire. I totally fell for it. It's almost embarrassing enough to blush. There was a time when we were able to draw up an encyclopedia, an exhaustive catalog of all the objects in the world. Since then, everyday objects, every possession is an extension of my world is fragile.
One gesture away from losing all access to sustaining the fantasies I need.
What is a good life when something you desire is actually an obstacle to your The name of a color is the result of a segmenting between other colors, orange between new colors for old things.
Next slide. This film pulls from the writing of Lauren Berlant, particularly her text, Cruel Optimism. Berlant describes how something you desire can become an obstacle to your flourishing, how the good life fantasies of late capitalism keep us how the good life fantasies of late capitalism keep us in cycles of wanting, working, and acquiring, with the idea of the new and the better always at the center. This can be a trap where real political action or real material change gets set aside in favor of smaller pleasures, smaller desires, like a new pink phone. But desire is also necessary. It keeps us connected to the world and thrown into it. The film is not just an indictment of these types of desires, but is also about the pleasure of them and the pleasure of wanting things you know might be bad for you. In my photographs, I explore these ideas of novelty, obsolescence, and desire in other ways. Next slide. I often take outmoded images and rework their surfaces, rephotographing them and turning them into new pictures. For example, I will use a badly photographed trade advertisement for obsolete candy, or next slide, remake a photograph of a historical monument out of discarded plastic cups from the junk store. I search for plastics that have been designed with similar design details as ancient ruins. I think about how our most valuable or historical images tend to resurface in new and unexpected places, like on plastic cups. Next slide. In this next image, I remake a Jeff Koons Old Masters Louis Vuitton bag out of other darker pictures pulled from historical archives and from the internet. I think often about how the value signs of historical imagery or art get reworked and recontextualized by advertising in order to sell new things. Next slide. I also think about the ways in which how we treat objects can have bearing on the way we treat other humans, and how recently outmoded or kitsch objects and images can be used to talk about human relationships and politics. Next slide. Obsolescence often feels like it applies to us too, but we find ways to break out of this. Next slide. Most recently, I have been working with archival images of 18th century French doll costumes. Next slide. The original picture here is meticulously rebuilt in my studio in blown up sections using other images and objects purchased online. A text at the bottom tracks the provenance of each item as it comes from around the world through various websites into the final picture. Next slide. The texts include descriptions of scale and color from eBay, Amazon, and other sites, as well as more personal and often poetic descriptions of why the objects seem worth buying. Next slide. I often mix images and objects that used to be novel with ones that are currently novel to show how these things fold in on themselves and often end up in the same place. Next slide. To end, I want to show a brief excerpt from my newest film, Glass Life, a 6-channel video installation. Next slide. The film expands ideas of desire into the digital age, thinking about how distance, separation, and privacy are needed for desire to function. I felt in recent years like it was increasingly hard to step back and form a self against an endless wash of input and choice, and to make sense of what is important. We are all creating these giant archives of images and screenshots and saved things, but we are not often able to step back and bring it all to bear on our actual lives or to contemplate it. This film both tries to recreate the feeling of too muchness, of always missing something that social media and capitalism so often engender, and also tries to propose a way out through thought, beauty, and personal creativity. Here's a very brief excerpt. Thank you very much. Next slide.
Between the here and now of lived experience and the ideal is a distance which creates and maintains desire. And we know that in love, the reach exceeds the grasp. This photograph says, I am happy. This one says, I am free. We appear to be both obsessive documenters of our experience, yet largely indifferent to or overwhelmed by the. There was a before time, and there will be an after time. We return nowhere. Between life and death, we become other than ourselves. I want my shelf-life to be long. Life points beyond itself. Or does it? He says the word image is in bad repute because we have thoughtlessly believed that a drawing was a tracing, a copy, a second thing. Distorted dream symbol. Dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. The first modernity suppressed the growth and expression of self in favor of collective solutions. But by the second modernity, too many people have come to feel excluded from the future. You can have any color car you want, so long as it's Henry Ford. Year 1909. The alienation is real. Surfeit of weak ties suffocates stronger bonds seem available only through the online tools that have diminished them. The will to remain alive, which drives all humans forward. Our constant surveillance robs us of the will. The life-sustaining inwardness born in sanctuary finally distinguishes us from the machine. As recalcitrant users, we will not be obstacles. Still dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. No one will need to be good. Between the here and now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for this enticing presentation and the way that your work unremittingly navigates contemporary image culture in new ways. And it is my great pleasure to now introduce Peter Galison, the Pellegrino University Professor of the History of Science and of Physics at Harvard University. Peter's research is focused on the history and philosophy of black holes, and in addition to his writing on the topic, he is a producer of several documentary films, including Black Holes, The Edge of All We Know, made in 2020, which is in fact available on Netflix. In a second project, Peter is at work on the changing relation of technology to the self, the innermost personal and the astronomical. And his most recent film essay titled Dream of a Shadow will be screened tomorrow at Cinema Village in New York, for those of you who are in New York. So Peter, welcome.
Hello, it's a great pleasure and honor to be with all of you. Thank you for including me. I'd like to talk today about a strangely other image, an image of the black hole, which was the product of a work of 200 and more of my colleagues in a group that I belong to called the Event Horizon Telescope Collaboration. And in order to make a telescope big enough to see a tiny image of a black hole on the sky, and the black hole that we were looking at is 3 times bigger than the solar system, so it's not intrinsically small, but it's so far away, 55 million light years from Earth, that it required a telescope the size of the Earth. Well, we can't have a telescope quite the size of the Earth, but we can simulate one by taking telescopes and distributing them all over the Earth. If you click that slide again, you'll see as the Earth rotates and different telescopes come into a position to view the black hole, the image begins to form as we simulate putting together the shard as if you had a telescope mirror smashed, distributed over the surface of the Earth, and then all of those shards were brought together. All the information, the light that fell on those shards was collected, analyzed by a supercomputer, and produced this image that was seen in the 24 hours after we published it on April 10th, 2019 by more than 1 billion people. Next slide, please. But to get that image, we were tremendously worried that we'd get an image corresponding to that which we expected. We wanted to be able to be surprised or disappointed, or to get an image that we felt was robust, even if we discounted our expectations of what it should or ought to look like. So we divided up the imaging team into 4 groups, and each of those groups, without talking to the other, they were forbidden from showing images or speaking or emailing each other, had to come up with the best image. And they came up with these 4 images, which were similar enough so that we were very intrigued. Next slide. And one of the features, sorry, go back one, please. So that dark spot in the middle is the black hole, and the orange illuminated ring around it is billion-degree plasma that orbits around the black hole. Some of it eventually will fall in, some of it will spin off into space. But what was intriguing here was that we started by saying to each of the teams, use your judgment. Use your best expertise to recreate an image from the data that we've gotten from these telescopes sprinkled around the Earth. And then we compared them, and they corresponded. Next slide. But then we were worried that maybe all of us separately, each of the 4 teams, were bringing similar, though undiscussed, image expectations to the table, so to speak. And so we designed a system to go from that the computer choose test images, like a test screen that you would see on an old-fashioned television, or that are used to evaluate the color registration or the fineness of resolution of a camera lens. And we said to the computer, choose the best settings for this Earth-size camera that would reproduce known images in the best possible way. And that led us to a kind of mechanical procedure. These are dates in 2017 where we were observing. We needed good weather all over the planet on April 5th, April 6th, April 10th, and April 11th, 2017. We had that good weather, and the computer then produced these as the images that used the camera settings, so to speak, of our system that worked best to resolve known images. And so when we pointed it at an unknown image, we hoped that it would deliver similarly good results. And so this is an attempt. The 3 rows correspond to 3 different methods of producing the images. And again, all of them seem to indicate this ring around a dark spot, this black hole. Next slide. And then we decided we needed to have an image, a single image, not the millions of images that the computer was producing, but a single image that would, in a sense, collect all of these images into one image that would emphasize that which was in common among the different images and de-emphasize the things that were idiosyncratic to one method or another. So we took on one of the days of best weather, and everything was functioning more or less well, April 11th, 2017. And we took these three different methods. They're called here DiffMap, BHD imaging, and Smiley. The names aren't important for this discussion, but each of these produced something fairly similar: a circle, similarly sized black circle in the middle, disk in the middle, and then bright spot in the south. And then we averaged those so that the common features would be emphasized and the uncommon features, the ones that were idiosyncratic, would be suppressed. Next click. And so that common image, that average, represents the passage through the three stages of image production. First, expert judgment of the four teams. Second, a kind of mechanical registration of all the different settings that the computer could analyze and optimize over known images. And third, an averaging or idealization. What's interesting here, among many things, is that this proceeded in the opposite from the way the history of scientific imaging has worked over the last several hundred years. It began with idealization. It then became a kind of mechanical process of trying to reproduce the world with a minimum of human intervention. And it came to the present in allowing judgment. We went the opposite direction. We started with judgment, went to the mechanical, and finished with idealization. So this image that we see here, the image that you've probably seen and reproduced in many places, is actually the product of an immense long process of years and years of work with several hundred people to try to extract from these photons that have spent 55 million years coming to us, capturing them all over the Earth, bringing them together into a supercomputer, using the Earth itself as part of the instrument and its rotation as part of the instrument, and producing this image, a new kind of image, a strange and new vision of an astronomical object. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that insight into both the limits and possibilities of image making and its collaborative production. And now we are thrilled to share a presentation by Tyler Mitchell, whose work brings to the fore narratives of Black self-determination, weaving together evocations of the past and imaginings of a utopian future. Unfortunately, Tyler couldn't be here with us live today. And so we will first show a selection of slides followed by a pre-recorded presentation that Tyler has sent. So we can start with the slides.
Hi, everyone who's tuned in to this forum on contemporary photography. I want to thank the Museum of Modern Art and Roxana Marcoci sincerely for having me, and to Wolfgang Tillmans as well for his wonderful exhibition at the MoMA. And he serves as a huge inspiration for me in my work, so it's really a pleasure and a joy when I got the email to participate in this forum. I'm recording this a couple days early in London, as when this airs on Thursday, I'll be doing a talk here, but I've been asked to do a presentation about my work and my practice as it relates to this idea of are new pictures possible? So I'm just gonna read a short artist statement I've written about one of my bodies of work, I Can Make You Feel Good, which is a summary of work I made over 6 years across commissioned fashion work and personal work over the past 6 years. I often think about what white fun looks like and this notion that Black people can't have the same. Growing up with Tumblr, I would often come across images of sensual, young, attractive white models running around, being free and having fun, the kind of stuff that Larry Clark and Ryan McGinley would make. I seldom saw the same for Black people in images, or at least in the photography I knew of then. And my work comes from a place of wanting to push back against this lacking. I feel an urgency to create a body of images where Black people are visualized as expressive, effortless, and sensitive. I aim to visualize what a Black utopia could look like, and I love photography's possibility of allowing me to dream and imagine the possibilities of new utopias. In my work, I use the tools of documentary reportage, portraiture, fashion photography, art photography, and filmmaking, and I view fashion as a space and opportunity to use clothes to enhance my message about the body and the Black body. I make very little distinction between my commissioned and personal works, using them both as an opportunity to create this utopian universe, whether that's photographing Beyonce, Spike Lee, skaters in Cuba, or my close friends. Documented in real or fictitious and staged, my images are characterized by an interest in purity and intimacy, and in them, models recline, embrace each other closely, and peer into the lens, leaving evidence of a public display of affirmation and Blackness and a unifying visual text of hope. I also occasionally weave symbols into my portraits, such as water guns and plastic resin chains, symbols of repression, as a subtle reminder of the ways in which the Black body is still politicized and sometimes unable to move through the world as freely as I would like. And so that was something I wrote thinking about how I was going to frame up all of the work I've been making across photography and film for the past 6 or 7 years. And I was invited 3 years ago to do an exhibition at FOAM Photography Museum in Amsterdam. Prior to that, I'd been mainly doing commissioned work for magazines, much like Wolfgang in the 90s, taking friends, dressing them up in clothes, or working with a stylist to dress them up in clothes, and making portraits that I thought spoke to how I was feeling about the world around me, what it really meant to be Black in this contemporary moment, young and Black and creative in this contemporary moment. And that expanded into this statement and this sort of mission, I suppose, that I've carried on with my work. So this idea of new pictures being possible, I think, is a very significant question that I feel honored to be asked with this forum. And I think that in this current moment, pictures have the possibility to sort of expand narratives around representation, around ideas of Blackness as it relates to the outdoor world. And I think that photography in this moment can be used relationally, as Wolfgang has done so well in his exhibition, and proximity. In my exhibition, which I'll cue up some images in a PowerPoint here, I've placed 2 images in relationship to one another as a sort of attached diptych, where I've framed and mounted works next to one another that show sort of at once the beauty and devastation psychologically of Black life and sort of Black interiority and Black psychology. All of these things derive themselves from history, really. Gordon Parks, Roy de Carava, even reading novels by Toni Morrison and watching films, all these things inspire me in my work. And my hope is to sort of free photography of this sort of burden of boundaries, borders, and facticity. And by that I mean ideas of biographical information, which I think specifically Wolfgang does so well, is asking the viewer of his exhibitions to, rather than concern themselves with the facts of one particular picture, right? The who, the where, the what year even, or how the photographer knows the particular subject, but actually to take in a constellation of images as a sort of socio-political worldview, and to instead ask the viewer to confront what they see in themselves in the work. And so I hope that my work is operating on a similar level, in that I'm trying to call forth or unlock a certain specifically Black psychology through how I'm photographing people in relationship to the outdoors and in this sort of Edenic utopian vision. So thank you very much for, again, having me. I hope that this small presentation can give a glimpse into what my work is really about, and I forever support the expanding conversation around images and the centrality of photography in today's culture. So thank you again, Roxana. Thank you to the MoMA and to Wolfgang and to my other contemporaries presenting today for having me.
And now it is my pleasure to introduce some tremendously multivalent artist and activist, Zachary Drucker, who carefully explores the nuances of gender expression, sexuality, and queer experience in photographic series such as Relationship, a collaboration with Rhys Ernst exhibited at the 2014 Whitney Biennial, in performance video and film, including the 2013 She's Gone Rogue, and of course, as an Emmy-nominated producer of the documentary series This Is Me and the hit television series Transparent. So with that, welcome, Zachary.
Hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here to share this space with you. I'm beaming in from Los Angeles, California, the city of angels. I recognize the Gabrielano Tongva Nation as the ancestral keepers of the land that I live on. I am the Jewish granddaughter of 20th century immigrants who came to this country to seek a life free of persecution, and in deep gratitude to exist in this world, the art world, the MoMA universe, and to collide with all of you. I feel that being human is to be infinitely transformable, that we are all multivalent, that we are infinitely possible, that we are full of potential, and that we are ever expanding. I cannot imagine a world in which new images are not possible, because our lives are unprecedented. The times that we're living in are completely unprecedented. And we are infinitely possible. This is my current boyfriend. It's from a shoot that we did a few weeks ago. I did not take this picture, but he is just the sexiest trans man in the world who has never existed before. And this is like a Marky Mark Calvin Klein ad for a new world, for a world in which masculinity is interrogated and deconstructed and exists outside of biological assignment. Our lives, our bodies are possible in different ways because of the evolution of science and medicine. And to create love and to create art is the most noble thing we can do on Earth. Next slide. The creation of love is new every time. The collision of two forces, in this case, an immovable object, which is me, and an unstoppable force, which is my boo. This image is from shortly after we met, and the love that we create in our relationships is never the same thing. It's never the same thing twice. Next image. This is a photograph that I took of two of my girlfriends. Superstar Jamie Clayton in the foreground, who is an actress, most recently in Hellraiser. And it was taken in the last hour of 2019. And I was photographing the party, having this like tremendous, ominous dread, existential, deep dread that just came over me like a cloud in the moment that everybody was celebrating 2020, I had this feeling that it was going to be the most terrible year ever. And I couldn't shake it for days. I was like in this deep depression. Of course, she's wearing a 2020 sign across her chest. And time is, it's futile to resist a modernizing world. It's futile to resist time, because time wins. And time is delivering us to a place where progress moves alongside opposition, where things are both better and worse simultaneously, where the future is a space that we will always learn how to navigate by finding human connection and kindness. That is our saving grace forever, and it will always be. And that's my 5 minutes, folks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Zachary, for this personal and inspiring presentation, and actually for amplifying the beauty, I would say, of trans life, imagining it through your work, through photography and activism. It is my greatest pleasure to welcome writer, curator, and photographer Ariel Goldberg, whose life work, if I may quote Ariel, is to bring context back to images. Images on which to build the exhibition that they have been working for the past couple of years and which just opened at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, brings forth the rich context around photographic histories of trans and queer life. Ariel, we look forward to learning with and from you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Roxana, and thank you all for joining today. I'm zooming in from unceded Lenape land, and I wanted to shout out the Red Nation podcast, which I subscribe to on Patreon, and you can too. To answer Wolfgang Tillmans' question, yes, adamantly, I think new pictures are possible, but I think of this in relation to my practice as encounters, to think of newness as possible encounters. And I'll be showing just a few installation shots from this exhibition, images on which to build, that Roxana mentioned just opened as part of Photo Focus at the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati. And this exhibition reactivates photography that circulated in spaces of learning. And my research begins often with meeting someone and talking with them, often activists, artists, publishers, archivists, and eventually visiting archives that take many different forms, are often volunteer run, are often inside personal homes or housed in educational institutions. And I like to think of the ongoing encounters just as intergenerational conversations that I'm continually being invited into and trying to absorb and metabolize and then share with wider publics. And something I've been thinking about for this forum and Tillman's show is that a lot of the material forms of trans and queer image cultures from the 1970s through the 90s share a lot of tactile attributes in Tillman's work. So there's Xeroxes, unique temporary exhibitions, prints were often adhered directly to the wall. And of course, that was sidestepping cost and preciousness of framing, but also because these image cultures emerged out of really insurgent times, and they were using distribution of information and art by every means necessary. So this is a section of the exhibition called Little Gems. And here I trace 20 years of trans image networks. And on the left is a dramatically upscaled flyer for a slideshow called Lesbian Masquerade, which was presented by the Lesbian and Gay History Project in 1979. And it featured late 19th and early 20th century news clippings about people who were assigned female at birth, who then passed as men, and are known to us now as historical figures who cross the gender binary because their transgression was made into public scandals, and which was, often led to arrest if they were still living, and they would then have to reinvent themselves and sort of move to a new place. This wall also features upscaled correspondences between two trans activists, Lou Sullivan and Ben Power Alwyn. And it's really trying to get at the heart of their friendship, which was built through sending snapshots and clippings through the mail. And one of the goals of the exhibition is to stage the sort of immense feeling of recognition that Lou Sullivan and Ben Power Alwyn both articulated when they each viewed this slideshow Lesbian Masquerade and other similar revelatory encounters with images of trans and queer life. And Sullivan was in attendance at the 1979 premiere of this slideshow in San Francisco, and then reviewed it in Golden Gate Guys and Girls, which was an early trans support group newsletter in the Bay Area that he was active in before organizing the F to M, female to male support group that he also worked a lot on a newsletter for. So I'll just read the last quote because the text is small on this slide. Sullivan wrote about being in this slideshow, "This reporter was deeply moved and found it hard to hold back tears as the screen flashed a photo collage of predecessors I had come to doubt existed." Okay, next slide. So 15 years later, in 1994, this is a video of a panel discussion inside photographer Lauren Rex Cameron's exhibition, Our Vision, Our Voices, Transsexual Portraits and Nudes, which was at 848 Community Space in San Francisco. And Rex Cameron was also an active member of the growing F to M group that Sullivan founded, but tragically Sullivan had at that point already died of AIDS in 1990, and the group still lives on, actually. And this event, Transsexual Speak Out, ! Featured 4 trans advocates answering very basic questions about their day-to-day lives at the closing event for the photography exhibition. And this is Paula Kai Santos, who's still a social worker in San Francisco, and in the 90s was active in the San Francisco Human Rights Commission and with the Asian Pacific AIDS Coalition. And she's telling us there is a transgender community that is here, it's alive, it's well, it's visible. Next slide. Another section of the exhibition presents just a fraction of the photographic archives from the 70s through the 90s of Mexican Chicana photographer, artist, educator, and activist Diana Solis, who's currently based in Chicago. And her work here she's being filmed for a documentary, which is very exciting, so stay tuned for that. And next slide. Solis has been digitizing her archives for the past 6 years, and her work documents the extraordinary range of grassroots organizing that she's been involved in, including the social fabric of those spaces. This is a lesbian Latina night in 1981 in Chicago, Maryland's bar. Next slide. And the exhibition presents a lot of the flyers and ephemera that show the different activities of artists and activists and photographers. So Solis in the top left corner of this grid of 6 flyers is advertising the women's education program at Mujeres Latinas en Acción, which is still a thriving organization in Pilsen, Chicago. And this flyer is for a photography and poetry workshop from 1979. It was a free intergenerational workshop. And Solis also built a darkroom at Mujeres for this occasion. And the other flyers that are featured here are recruiting people to show up for demonstrations, slideshow events, or excerpts from other newsletters and informational pamphlets. And on the left is a close-up of Art Positive's flyer for the National Art Emergency Day in 1989. And this is directly addressed to Richard Oldenburg, then the director at MoMA, urging him to make a public statement against the Helms Amendment. And, maybe he did show up to the National Art Emergency Day, which was a demo on the steps of the Met in August of 1989. And next slide. Part of this exhibition work for me has been digitizing and securing influential projects like Jeb's Dyke Show, which is a photo history slideshow from a lesbian feminist perspective that she performed over 80 times from 1979 to 1984. And the Dyke Show is coming to New York City with the whole show, and it travels to Leslie Lohman March 10th to June 30th in 2023. And this is Jeb posing next to her installation with her friend Emily. And I want to show the photographers and artists with their work in this slideshow because the exhibition is a lot about how I'm also learning from them, and how to contextualize their work and represent it is very much about this conversation. Next slide. And this is Lola Flash standing in front of her cross-processed work, which is presented alongside of her work in the Art Positive collective, which was an affinity group within the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP. And the photograph on the right was featured inside of Art Positive's 1990 calendar called Militant Eroticism, which was a rebuke to the AIDS phobia and art censorship that came out of the Helms Amendment. So my concluding words are that these image cultures are now receiving the resources to enter wider circulation, which is awesome. And I hope they stage new encounters with different generations and publics, like I've had the opportunity to do at this show. And the pictures may appear to be new, but in fact, I think they're part of the fabric of communication and survival that traverses fine art, documentary, vernacular, photographic practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariel, for sharing that research. Wow, and these exhibitions and how they trace these ongoing encounters between people and archives and trans image and political networks. So exciting. And now please join me in welcoming Martin Gutierrez, whose artistic practice surveys the complexity of identity and its cultural representation, spanning photographs, films, billboards, music videos, performance, and a 124-page project for a magazine, Indigenous Women, deep dive into navigating contemporary indigeneity, gender, and sexuality. And yeah, so please, it is my pleasure to welcome you, Martin.
Hello. I'd like to begin with an introduction to an essay published yesterday on the Whitney website, written to accompany the Supremacy billboard exhibiting now via the Highline, via Intermix. Every now and then I start falling for what an artist is supposed to be. For what? Recognition. Can someone have too much visibility? It should be a concern, putting forward the currency of qualifiers, the definitions of self cast for this year's campaign. To cash in, we must disclose. We try to buy ourselves in the belief that authenticity is a brand, nurtured by the new millennium, nurtured by hours of reality TV, targeted by Barbie Dreamhouse and 3 easy payments of $29.99, captured by Gulliver's avatars with long yellow hair and big boobs. Dysphoria was Victoria's Secret. Miss Independent, misgendered. We don't know how to be adults, but we do know who has been positioned before the children, learning another dance in front of the phone, adding another filter, booking another surgery. We want to be her, and we want her to be our Yas queen, but Ariana Grande isn't even Latina. Next slide. Seen here, front and back covers of the Indigenous Woman magazine, released 2018. This was a catapult of making me an art star, which in very much, it was its goal. I think while it was a self-produced anthology of heritage and celebrated indigeneity, it was also trying to celebritize a minority that just doesn't circulate or doesn't get put forward. And I don't think this project to actually summarize as well, but I do know art has to be adjacent to other systems or industries beyond the art world to become culturally accessible to the masses. And maybe this was also the most educational project that I've endeavored, which I think as individuals who tend to be put forward to speak for our communities, it tends to be a dead end in a way, to become like a social educator about like what our needs are and being able to speak for an entire community. And so I think in a lot of ways, I think most of the work I'm going to show in this is from the magazine, but kind of how it's been recontextualized and kind of legitimized in different forms of reprinting, but also asking what an art exhibition can be, and in this case, what happens when it's a magazine, and when an audience can come upon something that's extremely accessible without the capital A of the art world. Next slide. So this is a editorial page. The magazine had, everything a fashion magazine has: brands, advertisements, interviews, editorials, beauty trends. But because everything was fabricated by me, it got to kind of sit in a tongue-in-cheek place and also kind of fulfill my own personal fantasies to see myself or people who looked like me or my family kind of celebritized or glamorized or made desirable in the public eye. Next slide. On the left, Caliente, which is kind of my Jürgen Teller-esque shoe ad for a Spanish brand, Fictional. And on the right, a mascara campaign for a covert girl or a cover T girl, depending on who's reading. Both I identify with and reference both Cover Girl, obviously the font, and Maybelline, with an added tagline: maybe she's born with it, maybe it's white privilege. Next slide. This is really for scale. Pictured behind me are a few images from the Demon series, which was also in the magazine, but did make its way to Venice. And I tend to work in series. I like in these kind of like casts of families, and kind of exhaust like a picture way of making, and then I get over it and kind of move on. Next slide. This is I wrote about this is a detail, but I wrote about the Demon series, and even the word demon in this kind of examining of language. Originally these were called goddesses, but I really felt like culturally and historically the characters that or the symbols or the icons that I could identify with were demonized. So it became demons, or a diabolized kind of feminine devotion for Aztec or Mayan or Yoruba deities from the ancient world. And this was kind of like a hair feature. I think it started almost also as a nail feature, and then it really became about these crazy hair pieces. This is Chin, who's the demon of lust, and alleged, creator of homoerotica and, petty prostitution and transvesticism between unmarried men and boys and in the Mayan civilization. Sound familiar to anyone? Next slide. So this is also from the magazine. This is from the series Masking, which was my I think my first like legitimate cover for Art Forum in January 2019. This mask was Red Spath. And I think the series was more from like the beauty standpoint of self-care or kind of tongue-in-cheek wellness. And so everything was a sourced raw material or ingredient that was found in a beauty product and kind of alleged enhancement for rebuilding your youth or your beauty. And in this case, I think I was just so tired of this ritual of shaving my face and putting on makeup and really like trying to transform into these like supermodels for the magazine that I really just wanted to feel beautiful, like as a way of navigating the world and almost conceal who I was and not have to just refocus on, the attributes that we paint, our mouths, our eyes, our, high cheekbones, whatever. This was probably one of the most like time consuming also, because I'm literally playing with food, laying on the ground, looking up. And so everything is kind of held by gravity in place. Next slide. This is also really for scale. This is like the last editorial in the magazine, Body and Thrall, and these went to Venice. Also, these were in the Arsenale in 2019. And I feel like the title itself was a play on words and a shifting between thrall, which means being under someone else's power, morally or mentally enslaved, and enthrall, which is to capture the attention, bewitch, ensnare, fascinate. And next slide. It's a detail of page 113. I think the mannequins were a huge help and kind of obsession for me at this point as counterparts, both like theatrically and just as masks to help with these kind of illicit erotic systems of conquest that I was portraying. Servitude is also the Oxford Dictionary of what thrall means. Next slide. This is just for the canon. I don't know what this work means yet. It's newish. I just like looking at it. Next slide. Okay. So, and this, I feel like this was kind of the pendulum swinging the opposite way. Magazine has been finished at this point. And this is 2020, Brigitte, from the series Plastics. And I think critically, we were in lockdown, and everything in terms of like my proximity to the aspiration that I was looking at of perfection and social media, beauty started to really look like this algorithm. or filter, like literal filter, where everything was becoming homogenized into this application or alteration of aesthetic. And it really made me feel ill, like mentally ill, for my own kind of pursuit of womanhood. And so this was kind of my examination of it as a series. Artsy posted these and people were really upset. People were really triggered, which I think is successful. Next slide. Anti-icon is probably the most recent work. This is a commission from Public Art Fund last year. And this series toured bus shelters for 3 major cities, including Chicago, Boston, and our very own New York. And I've wrote a few things about it, but I'm just going to read one. Whether a Magdalene or Mulan, Joan of Arc or Judith, she is a prophecy destined, both born before her time and visionaire of a future that will come to pass, fallen from the norms of society in life to rise unto an idol in death, even if worshipped as the Venus Aphrodite or Queen Cleopatra. She is the simultaneous mythos of aspiration annotated by history. And that I chose that partly because it really lists this cast of heroines, plus a few more that I pursue to embody. But next slide. Mulan, for me, is one that I wanted to talk about because I think for anyone who's familiar with the story, there's an obvious symbolic metaphor, and she's a queer icon or anti-icon, like the masculine facade, the armor that she has to disguise herself in. This was a plaster cast of a mannequin body that I'm wearing. And here there are 10 images in total. Next slide. But what many of you don't know or see is that all the anti-icons were actually nudes or are nudes. And Public Art Fund didn't know that either at the time, but and it was controversial, to say the least. But the challenge became, how do I exhibit a body of work that was already finished without revealing the constraints of the venue, right? So eventually I came to the conclusion to rephotograph the prints behind veils that were hung in front. Next slide. So this is anti-icon Gabriel. And this is the first time anyone has seen this work revealed. And I'm so excited to announce that I have been working on a book that will be published next year, I think, which will kind of encapsulate the total collection of anti-icons, uncensored as originally intended. Yeah, thank you, Roxana and Wolfgang, for this invitation to be a part of this beautiful panel of thinkers, makers. I didn't answer the question, actually. Are new pictures possible?
Thank you, Martin. I think you did in a different way than just point blank, but truly thank you for this presentation and for the imaginative power and criticality, in fact, that you bring in transforming the self and in challenging socially fabricated binaries. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce Neymar Green, whose practice integrating photography, performance, text, and spatial interventions is committed to co-creating community environments of play, exploration, and pleasure that center expansive and nuanced experiences of Black, Brown, and queer life. Neymar could not join us in person today, so we are going to now show her pre-recorded presentation.
Thank you, Roxana and Caitlin, for inviting me to join this conversation. I am going to begin with a poem by Banu Kapil called Ritual for Autumn Equinox. Invert yourself at the edge of the water so that the top of your skull or your hair makes contact with the current or wave. And if this is not possible, if your capacity to take this posture is restricted in any way, then feel it in your body first. And if that is not possible, or if feeling is not possible in this moment, then take a glass of water and add some pink Himalayan salt, fresh lemon juice, and pepper. Drink this. And if this is not possible, then lift your face to the rain. And if it never rains, then wait until the water finds you. Wait for the unexpected emotion that changes or charges your very real heart. And then step through the indigo door, as Rachel Pollack said, into another world. Are new pictures possible? Yes. What does it mean to go unseen? The possibility for new pictures emerges as we are forced to see and witness the lives of those who have been strategically pushed to societal margins. When I think about the possibility for new pictures, I think about the poignancy of using a photographic tool made in the 1950s, an era that could not or did not want to imagine the images I'm making today. I think of the archive. My practice is one of close reading, of interrogation, of spatial intervention, of pleasure, and of revision. I begin through the physical act of looking through an archive and the gesture of seeking, of observation, the desire to know a fuller picture. This is the first action. Portrait making is placemaking. When I first began making portraits of Black artists in urban green spaces in 2012, I was stunned by the external lack of imagination, the refusal to see a Black individuality or nuance that is comforted by green space, by urban public space as sites of leisure and refuge and play. Now in its 10th year, Jewels from the Hinterland holds a different meaning. It still pushes back on a myopic understanding of Black life, and it is now a living archive of New York City that gestures towards the places we frequented, the varying and often small degrees of separation, and the ways we orbit each other. It is a way of knowing someone and also understanding how we relationally and collectively build safe spaces for one another. I stumbled upon Catherine Opie's Dyke deck from 1995 in a library database. I hold this deck as a radical object. I was also grabbed by the idea of what it could look like in contemporary Brooklyn in late 2018. Through friends, collaborators, and an open call, an invitation was offered for anyone who then identified as a queer woman, non-binary, trans, or gender non-conforming person to participate in what would become Pursuit. Pursuit is an object, it is photography, it's an archive, it's accessible, it travels, it's a game, it's participatory, it lives life outside of me every single day, it pops up, it re-encounters me, it is scholarship, it is a book. And from this, from Pursuit, emerges Skin Contact in 2020 as a digital record and multisensorial celebration of queer life and pleasure while we're still living. It is not the formal portrait, but the life that happens around the making. It is the unmagnificent moments, the unstaged, the intimacies of the day-to-day, the playlists, the love letters, poetry, audio interviews, and meditations that are offerings, especially during the touchless time of the pandemic. For me, going to the ocean during the pandemic was the only thing that made me feel alive. As an artist, I'm invested in seeing and picturing queer people taking up space within waterways and lush landscapes, focusing on the blue and the green, areas rife with fertile possibilities for revisioning. And so I will end where I began, waiting for the water to find me. Thank you.
And now it is my absolute honor to introduce our next speaker, Zora Murff, an artist, educator, and author of several monographs, including most recently this year's True Colors or Affirmations in a Crisis, which, according to the blurb, is a manual for coming to terms with historical and contemporary realities of America's divisive structures of privilege and caste. Since taking up photography a decade ago, Zora has consistently grappled with the complicit entanglements of the photographic medium in the histories of spectacle, commodification, and race, combining his own images with archival and appropriated imagery. And please welcome Zora. The floor is yours.
Shout out Howardina Pindell. Good afternoon. American artist Cindy Sherman did blackface. I invite everyone to do an internet search to see the pictures that American artist Cindy Sherman made of herself doing blackface in 1976. Read articles by E. Jane, Marissa Booker, and Marina Garcia Vasquez, who all write truth to power about Cindy Sherman's racism. What does it mean to canonize racism? When I sat down to consider this question bringing us all together today, I thought of the positioning of the ideas of pictures and possibility together. Maybe how picturing, in the sense of conjuring an imagined something, creates possibility or the opportunity for a particular pursuit. The second thought that came to my mind was how pictures in their corporeal sense have been used by white people to picture race, something physical made metaphysical. Next slide. Next slide. Tukufu Zuberi is an American sociologist, filmmaker, social critic, educator, and writer who is dedicated to counteracting white erasure through exploration of the history of Africa and the African diaspora. He recently curated Decolonizing the Narrative, an exhibition that considers how the Africa galleries at the Penn Museum, and by association, other museums and institutions, have and still use African visual culture and material to create particular perceptions of what Blackness is and who Black people are. Next slide, please. Zuberi opens us up to the reality that collectors and curators have consistently bought into negative stereotypes of Africa and Blackness and use those understandings to contextualize cultures. All of those objects were collected under a colonial mindset. He used Decolonizing the Narrative to emancipate African material culture from the colonial mentality by providing the fuller context of their forms and functions inside of African society and culture. Next slide. This image depicts an Oba's or ruler's shrine. The shrine existed in the Oba's palace and were made as honorifics to the Oba to define their cultural significance. Next slide. This shrine was pillaged by the British in 1897, and transformed into loot. In Zuberi's words, the profound was turned into something profane. Next slide. Next slide. Race is a paradox. It is at the same time real and not real because its meaning is variable based under the context in which it is understood. For example, in 1682, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed legislation limiting American citizenship to whites and categorizing anyone non-white as slaves. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, abolishing slavery within the United States. Both of these examples demonstrate a global difference in how race is understood and used in the context of time and geography. Next slide. In addition to context, sometimes the means through which oppression is meted is paradoxical. The propagation of divisive concepts, or Act 1100, is the state of Arkansas's version of the anti-critical race theory legislation now popular across the United States. The act partially defines a divisive concept as the concept that an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race. There exists ample American history of open and nuanced white supremacist engagement in the adverse treatment of non-whites through the creation of stereotyped representations, like Cindy Sherman doing blackface. The idea of white supremacists using anti-racism to uphold white supremacy is an irony I can hardly bear. Next slide. The Met Museum writes about Charles Ethan Porter's image, untitled Cracked Watermelon, that Porter chose to paint a watermelon, a symbol particularly associated with free blacks, when it was increasingly defined for stereotyping. By reclaiming the subject in artistic terms, Porter challenged temporary racist trope. Next slide. Porter's watermelon reminded me of a time when I was a teenager and my mama came home from work heated after running into a white neighbor in the hall. He had said to her, "Hot day, isn't it? Perfect day to sit outside and eat some watermelon." I didn't understand her anger and discomfort. I was unaware of the watermelon's use as a pejorative way of portraying Black people. After Mama explained why she was offended by the neighbor, I had to consider the plurality and now paradox of the watermelon, something natural now taking on multiple meanings based on its context. Next slide. Met chose to contextualize Porter's painting by hiding his race. He was among the first African-American artists to exhibit his works nationally, and the only one to specialize in still lifes. This isn't a lie. Charles Ethan Porter was a talented Black American painter in a very long lineage of other talented Black American painters. But more importantly, Charles Ethan Porter was a talented painter in a very long lineage of talented painters. Positioning Porter as among the first African-American artists should really read, among the first African-American artists to be deemed acceptable for the tastes of white society. The tragedy of this being that Porter's physical appearance must precede his raw talent as a painter. Black people have been painting and been talented at it since forever. What can Black excellence mean when you're trapped in a white society? Can reclaiming the images of stereotypes alleviate the pain of not having had the privilege of crafting myself in my own image? Or like race, can images ever only be a politicized surface, keeping us trapped inside of this paradox? I wondered if Porter had any of these questions for himself in his time, but that nigga painted the motherfucking watermelon anyway. Next slide. Fuck it, I will too. Because the willingness to take the profane and work it into the profound is the best way I have found to make a new picture of race. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zora. That was an incredible exploration of the ways both museological and political context shape the way race is represented and experienced. And thank you. And now it is my deep pleasure to introduce Dion Lee, whose practice offers, among other things, a crucial reappraisal of the conventions of landscape photography, reflecting on the natural world as a site of ongoing violence, a container for traumatic histories, and potential space of sanctuary. And thank you for being here, Dion, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Roxana, for this invitation. Thank you, Caitlin. And it's been great to hear about everyone's practices. I'm very happy to be included in this group. So I'm going to show just some clips of videos that I've been working on. Some are complete, some are not. And I'm just sharing some like in progress thoughts. I feel like this is mostly a process talk, but I'll also be trying to address the central question of this forum. So I can cue the video. So an underlying inquiry in my work is one of curiosity towards people's relationship to land, but more specifically, how that relationship is formed. And when thinking about this, I move towards considering knowledge that is passed down through experience, information that is given to us in more formal ways like earth sciences, and of course, how knowledge is assumed and shared through photography. A medium that I think everyone in this crowd knows. It's a medium that is historically dedicated to truth, yet constantly failing to tell it. Most of my work starts from a photograph, as photography is my only true formal training as an artist, yet increasingly I don't make photographs or even specifically quote unquote landscape photographs. I often feel deflated or defeated even, wrestling with the medium's history of glorifying land. An example of this is famous images of Yosemite, for example, that show the park as this empty paradise of protection, despite the land already having stewards in the Miwok people. This pattern is repeated throughout the history of landscape photography, and for this reason, among others, rarely do my photos show a horizon line or land at all. I want to apologize, the video is a little choppy. Instead, I openly grapple with my relationship towards such pictures. I made this video titled Drafts in 2016. And it offered me a really simple but cathartic mode of working through my feelings around landscape photography at the time. I think of this video as me stumbling my way through trying to find a form of truth-telling, trying to make new pictures out of old and widely circulated ones. I had this book titled The World We Live In, which is where all these photographs are from. I had this book for months before I worked up the courage to tear through it. I was broke and in grad school, didn't want to buy another book, and I was absolutely attracted to this book because of the beauty of the images inside, and therefore I did not want to ruin it. This is just a short clip, but the video goes on to showing me going through more tearing and rearranging of the images in this book. In a way that's not as gentle as what's happening here. I see every failure as a lesson, and as I've said already, for me, the photograph always fails. Most obviously in scale, but also in actually providing information. Looking at an aerial image of any landscape is a view dedicated to distance, overtaking, and conquering. Even this photograph of the Earth's atmosphere can hold these underlying motivations. I feel like I'm always waiting in confusion between awe of an empty vista or an aerial view of wide open space, despite knowing the truth on the ground is more complicated. Slowly burning, running out of water, stolen, side of violence, and perhaps working in self-defense against us. This space between awe and despair for me is the truth-telling space. The questions of are new pictures possible? And for me, I'm applying that solely to landscape photography. But that question for me is easy to answer because it is clear that they are needed. I think I've made an okay argument so far. If I had a little bit more time, I could definitely say a lot more. But I think I've made an okay argument for the case that new landscape images are needed. The first step in something being possible is acknowledging its necessity. And I understand the limits of comprehension that can come with looking at photographs of places. So I try to work from what I call pedestrian research, an act of staying close to the ground, working from a place of not knowing, looking to common nature objects for knowledge, and using the body to explore ideas of belonging and reconciliation on unsettled land, while also recognizing the absurd brevity and high destruction of our species on this planet. But how do I make that into a picture? It feels like an impossible feat to comprehend that sort of deep time through the scale of my body. So instead of comprehension, I work towards play. I play with the idea of one day becoming a fossil, pondering my own disappearance and a question once posed to me by a student, which was the fossil the first photograph? Performing through my research and recording my experiments is my way of submitting to the archive, turning experiment into document, adding new kinds of pictures to the stack. This summer, I was in Big Sur, California with a research group called Unseen California. As a group of artists, we were thinking through problems in landscape photography, especially in tropes of the West. While on site, I came across a book plainly titled Archaeology 1990. I left the book open on a picnic table and let the wind push pages while I caught glimpses of photographs turned documents of archaeologists working to unearth what cannot be seen at the surface. Like my trouble with photography, I also reckon with the foundations of Western knowledge, who has historically collected, reframed, and reframed information, whose hands have done the digging, written the text, or hit the shutter. And how do we deliver power to the one who turns the page or gazes at the photograph, the pedestrian? What could we gain from new pictures of Earth taken from a perspective of unknowing, play, and staying close to the ground? The camera is certainly a tool of pedestrian research. However, wherever there's a hand on a camera, there is a risk of something being mishandled. So I wonder, when considering the possibility of new pictures, should we be prioritizing the hand or the camera? Thank you.
Thank you, Dion, for this inspiring presentation on land and belonging. It is now my personal pleasure to introduce my former curatorial colleague, Phil Taylor, who has now moved at George Eastman House, and he's a curator there. So Phil worked very closely with me on a number of projects, including the Wolfgang Tillmans exhibition, as well as its 2 publications. And along with Caitlin, I could have not hoped for more brilliant collaborators. We call it, of course, the dream team. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts, Phil, on this question that Wolfgang has posed.
Thank you so much, Roxana. I've understood this forum's prompt as addressing practice. I don't make pictures, new or otherwise, but I do collaborate with picture makers, alive and not, and others in museums who come together to consider how we might encounter pictures anew, all while working amidst epistemic structures often inherited from previous centuries. And in thinking about the labor necessary to create contexts in which pictures can be meaningful, I want to express solidarity with colleagues in Philadelphia with the PMA Union, Local 397, who are on day 18 of a strike in pursuit of a fair contract from the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In that spirit, I want to express my gratitude to those that have made today's forum a place for intellectual and creative exchange possible, especially to Caitlin Ryan, Marian Tonde, Mark Desert, Megan Feingold, Mitch Lightshoe, and of course, Roxana Marcoci and Wolfgang Tillmans. In a 2012 conversation with Beatrix Roof, Tillmans responded to a question about his layering of images in his book designs and asked, quote, "How does one arrive at new pictures?" End quote. With that idea of arrival as a kind of starting point, I'm going to ground the rest of my brief presentation in news pictures more than new pictures, and think about their propensity to reemerge across time and space and provoke a variety of telling affects. To start with, consider Wolfgang's work, Soldiers, the 90s, created across the decade of the title. It was first exhibited in various versions in Aachen, London, and New York in 1999, and now is on view in the exhibition at MoMA. Next slide, please. Soldiers, the 90s archives the photojournalistic trend of publishing pictures of men in uniform out of combat as objects of desire. In Tillmans' hands, the appropriated material maps an unsettling terrain in which sexuality, military force, and geopolitics overlap. As a curator, I thrill to this capacity of photographs to embody these apparent contradictions and multiplicities as they migrate across disparate contexts. Wolfgang's reframing and conjugation of news clippings amplifies their ideological function, while calling into question the pictorial conventions that frame soldiers as objects of desire. Moreover, the installation is historiographic, an attempt at periodization by way of the newspaper's daily accumulation of images, which exceed the facticity of what is depicted. Next slide, please. The artist and writer Stanley Wolakauanambla has often worked with news photographs and images from decommissioned press libraries and commercial studio archives. In a recent essay published in Bomb magazine, he posits that photographs are heteronyms. Stanley writes, quote, "They are objects with identical renderings, but endlessly differing meanings and enunciations. They are radically open, or to borrow from Marquise Bay, monstrously inclusive," end quote. Next slide. This capacity to be multiple, to be non-identical within similitude also fascinates me with regards to photographs. Lately, I've been thinking about the gag, the sight gag, and how corralling a diverse swath of art through gag as a concept might offer some kind of foothold into contemporary technical images. The gag encompasses a particular form of visual humor, one that often breaks from the narrative. A gag also inhibits orality, interrupts language and discourse, and it implicates the body in circulation and transmission of meaning. Gag is visceral and tied to performance. Next slide. I started working at the George Eastman Museum in January, and my colleague Megan Jordan introduced me to a rich archive here, a collection of approximately 6,000 news service wire photos made between 1937 and 1975, assembled by the editor Vincent Jones. Jones saved photographs that crossed his desk, and he sorted and classified them into folders according to subject matter, genre, or mode. Among these are 2 folders labeled gags. Within this collection of news photo gags, I recently encountered this picture linked to the flooding of the Grand River that assailed Chillicothe, Missouri in June 1947. Frankly speaking, this is a picture that gnawed at me. Its humor is on the nose. It's at least a touch too clever. I'm intrigued by how a news photograph such as this one must have behaved in its historical context upon first publication, as news after all. The photograph was circulated widely through the Acme Wire Photo Agency and ran in Life magazine as the picture of the week. Here, the gag occludes the real human lives inundated, figuratively incorporating them through the swimmer of the corporate billboard, in which the caption likens to a film set. In that regard, the gag's emissions also constitute a kind of violence, a papering over or sublimation of the trauma at the core of the event. And of course, I'm thinking about how the image of a petroleum company's advertisement forecasts an ideal swimmer, consumer, survivor for an era of climate disaster. As an exhibition maker and visitor, this capacity of photographs to accumulate meanings seems to interrupt other modes in which we are regularly assailed and absorbed by images. Next slide. Turning towards a close, I want to return to a photograph by Wolfgang Tillmans that appears very near to the final exit in the exhibition at MoMA. This was a work that was new to me. I don't think I had seen it until I visited the exhibition. and it too has gnawed at me. That sensation, I think, owes much to the picture itself, and also to the ways in which a series of motifs and ideas, both poetic and political, are layered into the sweep of the exhibition and aggregate as I move through the galleries at MoMA. Next slide. The absent sweating body whose traces create a shoreline of dried salt incrustation on the dark textile take me back to the band of small photographs in the first gallery at MoMA. The chemistry squares capturing dancers and revelers at a London party on the night in 1992. Likewise, the play of light and shadow across the depicted surfaces, the almost black and white palette of the picture, the sense of salt crystals forming on a sensitive surface, seem to evoke the chemical nature of analog photography itself. Next slide. And this accretion of mineral traces leads me across the final gallery at MoMA to a large inkjet print of an industrial landscape in West Virginia, dusted with chalk. This associative network of geological material, extraction, photography, and the materiality of human bodies, in ecstatic connection and mutual vulnerability, builds across the exhibition. For a picture to invoke a heat wave in 2020 makes the photograph shadowed by the realities of anthropogenic climate change. Looking at the t-shirt again, I automatically complete the serif text as howl, making it a Ginsbergian lament, a melancholic owl of Minerva. Next slide. With this swirling in my mind and body as an exhibition visitor, there's something incredibly moving about viewing Heatwave and then proceeding through the exit doors into MoMA's daylit atrium and seeing this picture, Clouds 1 from 2008, a large-scale photocopy enlargement in which ink and form alike seem at the limits of representation, on the threshold dissolving into nothingness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil, for that meditation on the affective power of news pictures and the geological, and for those insights into the exhibition here at MoMA and putting it in dialogue with Stanley's work. Thank you. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our penultimate speaker, Jory Manaya, a multidisciplinary artist working across media to explore the relationship between technology, the performativity of identity, and the possibility of a decolonized self, using, as she has put it, the gaps, disconnections, and misinterpretations as fertile ground for creativity. And so welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you, Roxana and MoMA for this invitation, and Wolfgang Tillmans for the amazing exhibition that is contextualizing this conversation. The question, are new pictures possible, seems to point at ubiquitousness or an oversaturation of images, a relation to the images that precede us, or the idea that everything has been done. The way I've been thinking about this in the process of preparing for this presentation and in my practice in general is in relation to a history of images that frame or inform the way that I, people like me, or places like where I come from, the Dominican Republic, has been imaged and by extension imagined and understood through a narrow lens. Through a gaze that is circular and in turn continues to produce these images and produces the spaces offered to us to occupy. Next slide, please. For a number of years, I've been confronted with the feeling that a lot of the signifiers that frame the way ideas of identity are projected onto me are somewhat inescapable. So I decided early on that I would embrace those constructions and try to sabotage them from within an embodiment that acknowledges them, but expands and transforms them at the same time. This is a Google search for Dominican women. Next slide. I think you can hit play, it's a video. Should be a video, yes, okay. In 2016, I created the installation titled #Dominican Women Google Search, expanding from initial 72 DPI collages I had made in my computer screen with the found images from the Google search seen in the previous slide, blowing up the digital cutouts to a 1-to-1 scale, meaning these body parts are printed to match average human proportions. And in the process, embracing the low resolution and pixelation of the images as a testament to their provenance and widespread circulation, but also as a manifestation of my interest in opacity, as a way to deal with the exploitative and violent consumption these images relate to. You can play the next slide. In recent years, I've dug deeper into historic images of women in the Caribbean, particularly in magazines and posters, ethnographic and pseudoscientific material, next slide, postcards from the region, and other sources. Next slide. I continue processing these repositories I've accumulated in the form of collage, trying to find respite, next slide, productive juxtapositions and incongruities, next slide, and continuums. This image specifically uses one of the results of the Google search for Dominican women layered on top of a photo of an African woman exhibited in a human zoo at the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1889. Next slide. In turn, these collages and installations have informed my practice of making images from scratch, meaning as opposed to from appropriated sources, like in the series Containers. Next slide. Where I've been photographing myself wearing bodysuits that I make out of hypertropical patterns I've been collecting throughout the years. Next slide. Which are sewn in shapes that force me to embody repeated poses from the Google search I did after I classify these poses and find the ones that repeat the most, many of which relate to our historical traditions of image making. Next slide. And which are photographed in spaces that look natural, but are really human-made or manicured to different degrees. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. In parallel with this exploration of containment and disruptive embodiment, next slide, most recently, I've also been interested in exploring the idea of release, respite, and agency in this series named Divergences, that uses compositions I make photographing different gestures taking off the bodysuits from the Container series as a base onto which I then also collage scanned, painted, or found imagery and textures. Next slide. And shade and highlight volumes in Photoshop as if I was painting. Next slide. To create these images that start as performative photos and then become this hybrid of digital processes to finally end up back as a printed image. Next slide. I wanted to end my presentation with this piece from 2018 called Tropticon, in which I used photos I made at the New York Botanical Garden, where I photographed tropical flora, exoticized and artificially maintained inside the greenhouse, and at the same time, capture the outside native flora through its reflection in the glass. Although you don't really see much of that because I ended up pixelating the images. Next slide. And then I use them to cover this greenhouse, and which then becomes opaque on the outside and transparent on the inside. When I talk about this piece, I talk about many other things relating to offering this empty space as opposed to the imagined exoticized flora that usually inhabits the spaces and the colonial proposal. But I think that in relation to this matter of are new pictures possible, there's a poetic invitation to imagine what other images are possible when you enter this space with this piece. So I wanted to end at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jory, for your insightful presentation on your work and the history of images. And now to conclude, Wolfgang Tillmans has a short pre-recorded endnote since he had to leave us halfway through on some of his own pictures in the exhibition.
Hello, I'm Wolfgang Tillmans, and on this forum's question, are new photographs, are new pictures possible? I mean, it's a difficult question, obviously. I like to think yes, and when thinking about it and looking at works, pictures to talk about, I came back to the very fundamental of photography being a translation of the three-dimensional world into two-dimensional photographs, pictures, and that in itself is such a huge leap, which we, of course, always take for granted, no? That it is this, the result is flat. And, but I somehow never took that for granted, and I've always had that very much at the core of my awareness when making photographs, that what I'm looking at is not what will be on the paper, and what will be and what is on the paper is not the real thing. And I guess this photograph, for example, from 2017, Faltenwurf Pines, is a new picture, even though it came out of an ongoing group of works that I started in 1991, and progressing, I guess, here, yes. And this is called Paper Drop Novo from 2022, an example of a group of works under the name Paper Drop, which I began in 2001. And I believe that 21 years later, there is still something new possible in this family of pictures, which I add to only sporadically. Sometimes I don't work on them for 3 years, sometimes they are dormant for a year. In total, there are maybe 35 over the course of 20 years. And this is again about the translation of the three-dimensional into the two-dimensional, in this case, the three-dimensional being actually a sheet of chromogenic paper folded onto itself. And Tree Filling Window from around 2002. Also, I show this here because it became new in recent exhibitions. It's been around, but it somehow has become more prominent, and so photographs in my use and world get a new role which they play architecturally, in this case, for example, in the exhibition at MoMA, and so the expanding of new can also be through context, and of course new can very much happen, and usually happens because new subject matter is has developed. And over the course of the 2000s, I observed that the headlights of cars became ever more aggressive and elaborate and shark-like, unlike the round and square headlights from the 1990s and earlier. These symbolized, to me, an understanding of the automakers and designers of a more competitive and well, aggressive reading of their biased aspirations. And in 2011, I finally did something about this observation, and was able to photograph these headlights, which I felt never really quite was possible technically, or I didn't feel convinced. And at one moment in time, in this case, in a deep underground car park in Tasmania, suddenly this observation that I had made over the course of many years suddenly became possible to crystallize it literally in 5 photographs. And on the other side, the technical advances have allowed me to make new photographs, like this one called Concrete Column 3, which is from 2021, and it is photographed at an early morning, just with quite dim light, when construction workers started pouring concrete, and I was just finding the balance where the shutter speed is fast enough to freeze the concrete in motion as it is pouring and flowing, freezing it in time and showing this liquid as what it actually is. It's a solid. It's a mix of rock and cement and water. And in this detail here at the bottom on the steel rebar, one can see this strange aggregate, this pivoting between being solid and liquid and flying. Some of these rocks you see are flying mid-air, and this is hanging in the last room at MoMA, and is somewhat for me a picture of infinity, of an infinity of information that I can never understand, and a slice of time that can never be repeated in this way, and an information, a detail that or a myriad of details that is there in its greatest clarity, and yet it means nothing. And to bear that has been something that I found an interesting challenge and acceptance when working with new digital technology in recent years. Yeah, I guess must have definitely reached 5 minutes. Thank you, and I leave you with another paper drop called Paper Drop Passage from exactly the years switching from 2019 to 2020. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Wolfgang, for your inquiring mind and curiosity about the observable world, which has in fact generated the context of these conversations today. And so, having so precisely reached the conclusion of our time, Caitlin and I will end with words of gratitude for the generous, diverse, caring, critical, brilliant contributions of each one of the presenters. It would be a pleasure to welcome you to the exhibition, to the Wolfgang Tillmans To Look Without Fear show at MoMA. And we would also like to thank our colleagues, Megan Fingold and Marian Kande, for their invaluable collaboration on this forum, as always, and to our audiovisual team, And thank you all so much for joining us, all the guests. Happy fall and warmest wishes. Bye.